The rain started just past the state line. Not heavy, just enough to make the windshield smear and the road turn into a long dark ribbon that looked like it had been poured from somewhere ahead of him, somewhere he could never quite reach. Marcus Hale had been driving for 11 hours by then. His logbook said 9, because the logbook always said what it needed to say, and nobody at dispatch cared about the difference as long as the freight arrived on schedule. He had a load of industrial refrigeration parts bound for a distribution center outside of Tulsa, and he was running us -283 south through the western edge of Kansas, where the land flattened out so completely that driving at night felt less like moving through space and more like hovering in place while the darkness shifted around you. He liked these runs. He had told his ex-wife that once years ago, and she had looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for things she found not offensive but genuinely incomprehensible. "How could you like that?" she had asked. "All that nothing." And he had not been able to explain it then, and probably could not explain it now, but the fact remained that he did. There was something about the emptiness that calmed something inside him. The daytime runs through metro corridors, the congestion around Kansas City or Dallas. Those made him feel like he was slowly being compressed. Out here, the pressure released. The world opened up and there was just the engine and the road and the rain and the slow procession of mile markers that came and went in his headlights like the vertebrae of some immense animal he was traveling along the spine of. The GPS had been behaving strangely for the last 40 minutes or so. He used a dedicated trucking unit mounted to the dash, not his phone, because cell service out here was theoretical at best. And the unit had its own satellite connection and preloaded maps that updated quarterly. It was reliable in the way that boring things are reliable. It told him where to turn, where the way stations were, where the low bridges waited to scalp an unwary trailer. He trusted it the way he trusted his tires. Not with affection, but with the quiet confidence that comes from years of a thing doing exactly what it is supposed to do. But tonight it had begun to stutter. The screen would freeze for 10 or 15 seconds. The little blue arrow representing his truck hanging motionless over a stretch of road while the actual truck continued forward. And then the display would jump and catch up, the arrow lurching ahead like a man startled awake. The estimated arrival time kept recalculating. First, it added 6 minutes. Then it subtracted 12. Then it added 43, which made no sense at all because nothing about his speed or route had changed. He tapped the screen with his knuckle, the way people tap things they do not understand, as though physical contact might communicate something that patience cannot. Around 11:30, the unit told him to take an exit he had never seen before. He knew this stretch of 283 well enough to have opinions about it. He knew where the rest areas were, which ones had functional vending machines, which exits led to gas stations that were actually open after 10. And he had never, not once in perhaps 40 or 50 trips along this corridor, noticed an exit here. But the sign was there, green and reflective in his headlights, listing a town name he did not recognize. Sutner, population not listed. The GPS was insistent, the blue line curving off the highway and down the exit ramp with the calm authority of something that has never been wrong before. He almost ignored it. He very nearly did. But the fuel gauge had been nudging toward the quarter tank mark for the last half hour, and the next station he knew of was 60 miles south, and 60 miles on a quarter tank in a truck pulling 47,000 pounds of cargo was not a gamble he liked to take. If there was a town here, even a small one, there might be a pump. And the GPS seemed to know about it, which meant it was on the map, which meant it was a real place, which meant there was probably diesel. He took the exit. The ramp curved down and to the right, depositing him onto a 2-lane road that ran straight west into the dark. The rain had eased to something barely more than mist, and the road surface was that particular shade of wet black that makes headlights reflect back at you in a way that is almost beautiful. There were no other vehicles. There were no farmhouses visible, no yard lights, no grain elevators on the horizon. Just the road and the fence posts along its edges, appearing one after another in his lights like sentries standing at attention as he passed. He drove for about 7 minutes. That was longer than he expected. Most highway exits in rural Kansas delivered you to a town within 2 or 3 miles, but the odometer ticked past 4, then 5, and still there was nothing ahead but the road and the dark and the mist. He began to think he had made a mistake. He began to think the GPS had made a mistake, which was a different and more unsettling thought, because the GPS making a mistake meant the GPS could make a mistake. And if it could be wrong about this, what else might it be wrong about? This was not a productive line of reasoning, so he let it go and drove. Then, the town appeared. It did not emerge gradually the way towns usually do, with the first scattered houses, and then a speed limit reduction, and then a proper grid of streets. It appeared all at once, as though it had been waiting behind a curtain that the road passed through. One moment there was nothing, and the next moment there were streetlights, regularly spaced, casting pools of amber light onto sidewalks and parked cars in the fronts of buildings. The speed limit sign said 30, and he slowed. There was a water tower on the right, partly visible against the low clouds, the name Suttner painted on it in letters he could just make out. First thing he noticed was that the town looked maintained. This was notable because he had seen plenty of dying Kansas towns, and they all had the same vocabulary of decay. The peeling paint, the boarded storefronts, the collapsed roof of a building no one could afford to demolish. Suttner had none of that. The buildings along what appeared to be the main street were intact, their facades clean, their awnings whole. A hardware store, a small grocery, a post office with an American flag hanging from a pole, limp in the windless air, a church with a white steeple. Everything looked as though it had been built and then carefully preserved, or as though it had simply never aged. The second thing he noticed was that no one was outside. This was less notable because it was nearly midnight and raining, and people in small towns tend to go to bed early. But there was something about the quality of the emptiness that nagged at him. It did not feel like the town was sleeping. It felt like the town was still. He turned onto the main street, which the GPS identified as Garfield Avenue, and drove slowly, looking for a gas station. The truck's engine was loud in the silence, and he found himself wishing it were quieter, though he could not have said why. On both sides of the street, the houses had their porch lights on, nearly all of them. Soft yellow light over front doors and on porch ceilings, illuminating welcome mats and wooden steps and the occasional rocking chair. But no one rocked in the chairs. No dogs barked at the sound of his engine. No curtains moved in the windows. He found the gas station at the south end of the main street. It was a small, independent operation. 2 pumps under a canopy. The kind of place that still had the old analog dials. The canopy lights were on. The pumps looked functional. A sign in the window of the attached building said open in red letters. And there was light inside, the fluorescent kind that makes everything look slightly clinical. He pulled the truck onto the apron, which was tight but manageable, and climbed down from the cab. The air was cool and damp and very quiet. He stood for a moment, listening. He could hear the faint ticking of his engine cooling. He could hear the rain, so light now it was more of a texture in the air than a sound, and he could hear nothing else. No hum of distant traffic, no insects, no wind. The silence had a quality he had never encountered before, not an absence of sound so much as a presence of stillness, as though the air itself was holding something in. He walked to the pump and lifted the nozzle. It was a diesel pump, which was his first piece of luck all night. He squeezed the handle. Nothing happened. He replaced the nozzle, tried the other pump. Same result. He looked at the building. The sign said open. The lights were on. Maybe the pumps had to be activated from inside. He walked to the door and pulled it. It opened. A small bell above the frame jingled, and the sound was so startlingly normal that it almost made him laugh. The interior was a standard gas station convenience store, the kind that exists in 10,000 iterations across the Great Plains. Shelves of chips and candy, a cooler along the back wall with sodas and beer, a counter with a register, a coffee maker with 2 pots. One regular and one decaf, both with coffee in them. He could smell the coffee, and it smelled fresh. No one was behind the counter. No one was in the store. He waited. He said hello. His voice sounded flat and small, the way voices sound in rooms that are not used to hearing them. He said hello again, louder. Nothing. He leaned over the counter and looked at the area behind it. There was a stool. A small television set turned to a channel that displayed only static, and a magazine open to a page about bass fishing. The register was on but showed 0 on its display. He looked for a bell on the counter, the kind you slap to summon someone. There was not one. He walked back outside and stood under the canopy. He looked up and down the street. The street lights burned. The porch lights burned. The town state of complete physical integrity and complete human absence. He thought about this. He thought about it the way a practical man thinks about things, which is to say he looked for the explanation that required the fewest assumptions. Shift change, he thought. Or the attendant was in the back, or in the bathroom, or had stepped out. People left gas stations unattended in small towns. He had seen it before. It was not strange. He told himself it was not strange. He decided to wait a few minutes and then try the pumps again. In the meantime, he walked across the street, partly out of curiosity and partly because he wanted to stretch his legs after 11 hours in the cab. There was a diner on the opposite corner, a place called Mabel's, with a hand-painted sign and checkered curtains in the windows. The lights were on inside. He looked through the glass. The diner was set up as though it were in the middle of a normal evening of service. There were plates on several of the tables, cups of coffee, a glass of water with condensation still beaded on the outside. At the counter, there was a plate with a half-eaten piece of pie on it, the fork resting on the edge of the plate as though someone had set it down to take a breath between bites behind the counter. Through the kitchen window, he could see the glow of the warming lamps. He tried the door. It was open. The smell hit him first. It was the smell of a working kitchen, grease and coffee and something baked. It was warm inside, which meant the heating system was running. He walked to the counter and looked at the pie. It was cherry. He looked at the coffee in the nearest cup. It was dark and full, no ring of dried residue around the inside of the cup, no skin on the surface. He touched the side of the cup with the back of his fingers. It was warm. He stood very still. He was not frightened, not yet, but something had shifted in his chest, a tightening that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, the way a shadow is adjacent to the thing that casts it. Warm coffee meant someone had poured it recently. Recently meant within the last 20 or 30 minutes, maybe less, which meant someone had been here, which meant someone should still be here or nearby or somewhere. But the diner was empty, and the street was empty, and the gas station was empty, and the town, as far as he could tell, was empty. He walked behind the counter. This was not something he would normally do. He was not the kind of man who went behind counters or through doors marked employees only. But the situation had taken on a quality that suspended the normal rules. The way a power outage suspends the normal relationship between a person and their flashlight. He looked at the kitchen. The grill was on, set to low heat. There were 2 hamburger patties on it, cooked through, sitting in their own grease. A basket of fries sat in the fryer, the oil still hot enough to produce a faint shimmer in the air above it. Everything suggested that the kitchen had been active very recently, and had then been abandoned without any of the shutting down procedures that a person would normally perform. You would not leave the grill on. You would not leave the fryer hot. You would not walk away from a plate of food with the fork still on the edge. He turned off the grill. He did not know why he did this. It felt like the right thing to do, or maybe it just felt like a thing to do, and doing a thing felt better than standing still in an empty diner trying to understand why the coffee was warm and the people were gone. He walked back outside. He looked at his watch. It was 12:14 in the morning. He looked at the clock on the wall of the bank across the street. A large analog clock with Roman numerals, the kind that small-town banks install to project an air of permanence and reliability. It read 8:17. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the clock in the window of the hardware store. It also read 8:17. He walked down the sidewalk to the church. The clock in the steeple, barely visible in the ambient light, read 8:17. Every clock in the town had stopped at the same time. He stood on the sidewalk and processed this. His mind offered him explanations, and he examined each one. A power surge could stop electric clocks, but the steeple clock was almost certainly mechanical, and even if a surge had stopped the electric clocks, the power was clearly back on, and most digital clocks would either reset to 12:00 or resume counting. These clocks had stopped and stayed stopped as though time itself had reached 8:17 and simply declined to continue. He went back to his truck. He sat in the cab with the door closed and the engine off. He told himself he was being foolish. He told himself there were 100 explanations for all of this that did not involve anything he needed to worry about. Towns had problems. Power grids failed. People went to bed. Clocks broke. Coffee stayed warm for a while. These were all ordinary things that were only strange because he was experiencing them simultaneously, and because he was tired, and because the rain and the dark and the silence were conspiring to make ordinary things feel ominous. He picked up his phone. No signal. He had expected this, but the confirmation was unwelcome. He tried the truck's CB radio. Static on every channel. Not the intermittent static of weak signals, but a solid, unbroken wall of white noise. The kind that sounds almost intentional, almost architectural, as though it has been built to fill a space that would otherwise be empty. He tried the GPS. The screen showed his position clearly. He was on Garfield Avenue in Sutner, Kansas. The town was rendered in the same level of detail as any other town on the map. Streets, intersections, the shapes of buildings. But when he zoomed out, trying to see where Sutner sat in relation to the highway, something was wrong. The road he had taken from the exit did not connect to anything. It simply began at the edge of the map data and ran to the town, and the town sat in a blank space, a void of unrendered terrain, as though the land it occupied existed on a different layer of reality that the satellites could see, but could not fully reconcile with the geography around it. He zoomed out further. US -283 was there, a clear north-south line to the east, but the exit he had taken was not marked. There was no interchange, no off-ramp, no road leading west to a town called Sutner. According to the wider map, the highway ran straight through that area without interruption. Yet here he was, sitting in the town, and the GPS knew the town's streets but did not know how he had gotten here. He started the engine. The sound of it was enormously comforting. The deep diesel rumble that meant motion was possible, that meant he was not trapped, that meant the machine still worked even if the world around it had become unreliable. He pulled out of the gas station and drove back up Garfield Avenue. Retracing his route, he would find the road, get back to the highway, and drive to the next exit and get fuel there, even if it meant running the tank dangerously low. He wanted to be away from here. As he drove, he looked at the houses one more time. The porch lights were still on. The windows were still lit from within, and now for the first time he noticed something about the light inside the houses. It was steady, perfectly unnaturally steady. Not the flicker of a television, not the shift of someone moving between a lamp and a wall. Just light constant. And even as though the houses were not homes but display cases, illuminated to show that something existed inside them without revealing what that something was. He looked more carefully at one of the houses as he passed. The curtains were partially open, and through the gap he could see a living room, a couch, a coffee table with a newspaper on it, a lamp on an end table. The lamp was on. The room was exactly what a living room should look like. But there was a quality to it that reminded him of something, and it took him a moment to place it. It looked like a furniture store display. Everything was arranged with an almost theatrical precision, each object positioned in relation to the others as though the room had been composed rather than lived in. No clutter, no asymmetry, no shoes by the door or jacket over a chair. The room was a room the way a painting of a room is a room. It contained all the correct elements, but it did not contain the particular chaos that human habitation produces. He drove faster. At the north end of town, where Garfield Avenue should have connected to the road that led back to the highway, the street simply continued. It did not end or curve. It ran straight north between two rows of houses, and then beyond the last house, it continued into the dark as a two-lane road that looked exactly like the road he had come in on. He followed it. He drove for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the headlights reaching into the dark, the fence posts appearing and disappearing. He watched the odometer. He had driven about 4.5 miles when the road entered Sutner from the south. He was back in the town. He had driven straight through it and straight back to it. He stopped the truck in the middle of the street. He sat there for what felt like a very long time, but was probably less than 2 minutes. His hands were on the steering wheel and his heart was beating in a way he did not like, fast and thin. The way it beats when the body has received information that the mind has not yet agreed to accept. He was a rational man. He believed in the physical world and its rules. He believed that roads went from one place to another, and that if you drove in a straight line you did not end up where you started. He believed these things because they had always been demonstrated to him without exception for 46 years. And now, in this small, well-lit, perfectly maintained, completely empty town in western Kansas, one of those beliefs had been contradicted. He tried the other direction. He turned the truck around, which was a laborious process on the narrow street, and drove south. Past the gas station, past the diner, past the church, past the last houses on the south end, the road continued into the dark. He drove 5 miles, 7 miles. He watched the odometer in the dark and the fence posts, and tried to feel optimistic about the probability that this time the road would lead somewhere else. It did not. After approximately 7 miles, the streetlights of Sutner appeared in his windshield, and the road delivered him to the north end of town. He parked the truck outside the diner. He turned off the engine. He sat in the silence in the dark of the cab and listened to the rain, which had picked up slightly, tapping against the roof with a sound like fingers on a table. He was not a man who panicked. He had jackknifed on ice outside of Cheyenne and had kept his composure. He had blown a steer tire at 70 on I-40 and had brought the truck to a controlled stop. He knew how to be calm when things went wrong, but those were situations with solutions he understood. The tire could be changed. The truck could be straightened. The problem could be identified and addressed because the problem existed within a framework of physical laws that he knew, and that worked. This was different. This was a situation in which the framework itself had changed, and he did not know the rules of the new one. He got out of the truck. The rain was light on his face and his hands, and it felt normal, and he was grateful for that. He stood in the street and looked at the town. It looked back at him with its lit windows and its stopped clocks and its empty chairs and its warm coffee and its absolute, impenetrable stillness. He thought for the first time that the town did not feel abandoned. Abandoned places feel like places that people have left. This felt like a place that people had never quite arrived at, or a place that existed in the gap between arriving and being present. A permanent almost that never resolved into actually. He walked. He did not decide to walk. His legs moved and he went with them because standing still had become unbearable. He walked down Garfield Avenue, past the hardware store and the grocery and the post office. He looked at the flag on the post office pole. It hung straight down, absolutely motionless, and he realized that he had not felt any wind since he arrived. The rain fell vertically without angle or drift. The air was still in a way that air in open country never is. He went into the grocery store. The door was unlocked. The lights were on. The shelves were stocked. He walked down the aisles slowly, looking at the products. Canned goods, cereal, bread, cleaning supplies. Everything was organized, fronted, pristine. He picked up a box of cereal and looked at the side panel. He found what he was looking for. The expiration date read March 2004. He set the box down and picked up another, April 2004. He walked to the bread aisle. The loaves were soft and fresh-looking, the way bread looks on the day it is placed on the shelf. The sell-by dates were in February and March of 2004. He went to the cooler. The milk was dated February 2004. The yogurt, March 2004. He stood in the dairy aisle of an empty grocery store in a town that did not exist on any map and held a container of yogurt that should have expired more than 20 years ago but showed no sign of spoilage. And he understood. He understood the way you understand something in a dream, not with logic but with a sudden total apprehension that bypasses thought and arrives directly as knowledge. The town had not been abandoned. The town had not been left. The town had stopped. Sometime in early 2004 at exactly 8:17. Whether morning or evening he could not say, the town of Sutner had ceased to participate in the passage of time. The food had not spoiled because for the food, no time had passed. The coffee in the diner was warm because the coffee had just been poured, was always just being poured, the moment of its pouring preserved in an endless present tense. And the people had been here. They had been eating their dinners and drinking their coffee and reading about bass fishing and buying groceries and doing all the things that people in small towns do at 8:17. On whatever day it was, that time stopped. And now they were not here. They were not here, and their food was still warm and their lights were still on and their clocks still showed the exact moment when something had happened to this place that he did not have a word for. He put the yogurt back in the cooler. He walked out of the grocery store. He stood on the sidewalk and looked down the street, and he felt something that he would later have difficulty describing to anyone, including himself. It was not fear, exactly. It was something older and deeper than fear. It was the feeling of standing in a place that should not exist, and understanding that your understanding of what should and should not exist has always been incomplete. It was the feeling of a map with a blank space on it, and realizing that you are standing in the blank space, and the blank space is full. He walked back to the diner. He went inside. He sat down at the counter, not because he wanted to, but because his legs were tired and the stool was there. He looked at the plate with the half-eaten pie. He looked at the fork on the edge of the plate. Someone had been eating that pie. Someone had set down their fork. Someone had stopped. He looked at the calendar on the wall behind the counter. It was a promotional calendar from a feed supply company, the kind they give away for free. It showed the month of February 2004. The 23rd was circled in red marker. He did not know what had been planned for February 23rd, 2004, and he realized with a slow, cold certainty that whatever it was, it had never happened. It had been circled and anticipated, and then the 23rd had never come, or had come and never ended, and the thing that was circled in red had waited, and was perhaps still waiting, the way everything else in this town was still waiting, in the permanent suspension of its 817. He became aware of the radio. There was a small radio on a shelf behind the counter, the kind with a dial and an antenna. It was on. He had not noticed it before because it was producing static, and the static was so constant, and so even that it had become part of the background, indistinguishable from the silence. But now he listened to it, and as he listened, he thought he heard something underneath it. Not a voice, not music. Something more like a rhythm, a pulse, a slow and regular pattern buried in the white noise, like a heartbeat buried in the sound of the ocean. He leaned closer. The pattern was there, and then it was not there. He could not tell if he was hearing it or imagining it. He leaned closer still. The static seemed to thicken, to become denser and more complex, as though it contained layers that unfolded the more carefully you listened. He had the sudden irrational conviction that the static was not random noise, but a communication in a language he could almost but not quite parse. A message from someone or something that had been broadcasting continuously since 8/17 on a day in February 2004, sending the same signal into the same empty room in the same empty town, and that if he listened long enough he would begin to understand what it was saying, and that understanding it would be the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He turned the radio off. The silence that followed was enormous. He stood up from the stool and walked out of the diner and did not look back. He got in his truck. He started the engine. He sat for a moment thinking. The roads looped. North and south both led back to the town, but he had entered from the east, from the highway. He had turned onto Garfield Avenue from the road that came from the exit ramp. If the north-south road looped, maybe the east-west road did not. Maybe the way in was also the way out. He turned the truck around and drove east. He found the intersection where he had first entered the town, where the road from the highway met Garfield Avenue, and he turned onto it. The road stretched out ahead of him east toward the highway, into the dark. He drove. He watched the odometer. 1 mile, 2 miles, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. At 7.5 miles, the road delivered him to the western edge of Sutner. He stopped the truck. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. He closed his eyes. He opened them. The town was still there. He was still here. The rain was still falling, and the lights were still on, and the clock still said 8:17. And the town of Sutner was still a place that existed when it should not have, and kept him inside it when it should not have been able to. For the first time, he felt something that he could identify clearly as fear. Not the fear of a threat, not the fear of harm, but the fear of a condition. The fear of being in a situation that does not have a visible exit. The fear of a man who has always known where he is and now does not know where he is in a way that is more fundamental than geography. He was not lost. He knew exactly where he was. He was in Sutner. The problem was that Sutner was not anywhere. He sat in the truck for a long time. The rain tapped on the roof. The engine idled. The headlights lit the road ahead. The road that went nowhere or everywhere. The road that left the town and returned to it, like a sentence that circles back to its own beginning. He tried to think about what he knew. He knew that the town was physically present and structurally intact. He knew that it contained no people. He knew that its clocks had stopped. Its food had not aged. Its lights were on. Its doors were unlocked. He knew that the roads leaving it did not leave it. He knew that his GPS could see the town but could not connect it to the larger world. He knew that his radio and phone could not reach anything outside. He knew that the rain was real and the cold was real and the truck was real and the diesel in the tank was getting lower. He also knew that he had entered the town. He had driven in from the highway. He had taken an exit and followed a road and arrived here, which meant there was a connection between here and the world he had come from. It existed. It had worked. It had carried him across whatever boundary separated this place from the rest of the country, the rest of reality, and it had done so in one direction. The question was whether it could carry him back. He thought about the exit ramp. He had been driving south on 283. The GPS had told him to exit. The exit had curved to the right, which meant west. He had driven west for about 7 minutes and arrived at the town. So the town was west of the highway, and the road connecting them ran east-west. But when he drove east, he ended up back in the town. The road looped. Unless the road did not loop. Unless the road was straight and the space it moved through was curved, bent back on itself like a ribbon twisted into a ring. In which case the road worked exactly as a road should work. It was the space that was broken. He did not know what to do with this thought. It was not a useful thought. It did not suggest a course of action, but it sat in his mind and it changed the way he looked at the town outside his windshield. He had been thinking of Sutner as a place he was trapped in. Now he began to think of it as a place that was trapped with him, or a place that was trapped in itself. A piece of the world that had become detached from the rest and folded inward, like a pocket in a fabric, containing everything it had held at the moment of its detachment, and nothing else. No new air, no new time, no new people. Just the 817, and the warm coffee, and the cherry pie, and the base fishing magazine, and the red circle around February 23rd, forever at 1:50 in the morning by his watch. He decided to try something. He pulled the truck to the north end of town, to the point where Garfield Avenue left the last house and became the road into the dark. He turned off the headlights. He turned off the engine. He sat in total darkness, the only light the amber glow of the streetlights behind him in his mirrors, and he waited. He did not know what he was waiting for. He was not a patient man by nature, but driving had taught him patience in the way that driving teaches everyone patience, by presenting you with hours that must be endured, because there is no way to skip them. So he sat and he waited and he watched the road ahead, which was invisible in the dark, and he listened to the rain, and he breathed, and he tried to empty his mind of the fear and the confusion and the low, persistent hum of wrongness that had been building in his chest since he first walked into the gas station and found no one there. At 2:23, by his watch, something changed. He could not see it. He could not hear it, but he felt it. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, a shift in the quality of the space around him, a subtle relaxation of something that had been taut. The darkness ahead of the truck seemed to deepen, or widen, or both. He had the impression that the road in front of him had opened, that whatever loop or fold or curvature had been returning him to the town had, for this moment, straightened. He did not hesitate. He started the engine and turned on the headlights and put the truck in gear and drove. He drove fast, faster than he should have on a wet 2-lane road in the dark, but speed felt essential, as though he were moving through a window that might close. The fence posts flew past. The road unreeled ahead of him. He drove for 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and at 7 minutes the road began to climb, rising up through a curve, and he saw the highway. He saw the headlights of another truck moving south on 283. And the sight of those headlights, the confirmation of another human being in another vehicle on a road that went somewhere, produced in him a sensation so intense that it was almost physical, a release that started in his chest and spread outward until his whole body felt light and loose and trembling. He merged onto 283 heading south. He drove. He did not stop. He drove past the exit where he might have gotten fuel because there was no exit. He looked for it. He slowed down and looked for the green sign with the name Sutner on it, and the ramp that curved down and to the right, and there was nothing. There was just the highway and the dark and the rain and the mile markers and the land stretching flat and featureless in every direction. No sign, no ramp, no road leading west, nothing. He drove for another 40 minutes until he found a truck stop that was open. A real truck stop with real people and real diesel, and a real cashier who looked at him with the mild boredom of a person working the overnight shift. He filled his tank. He bought a coffee. He sat in a booth and drank it and felt the warmth of it and tasted it, and it was ordinary, perfectly ordinary, and the ordinariness of it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever experienced. He pulled out his phone. He had signal now, 2 bars, enough. He searched for Sutner, Kansas. He found nothing. No town by that name in Kansas, or in any bordering state. He searched for Sutner in the NES database, the Federal Repository of Geographic Names. Nothing. He searched for it in historical records, in archived census data, in old USGS maps. He found references to a Sutner family who had homesteaded in western Kansas in the 1880s, and a Sutner township that had appeared on a single county survey map in 1903, and then never appeared again on any subsequent map or document. The township had been located, according to the 1903 survey, in the approximate area where his GPS had directed him off the highway. He drove to Tulsa. He delivered his load. He told no one about what had happened. He went home and slept for 14 hours, and when he woke up, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall and tried to organize the experience into something that could coexist with the rest of his life. In the weeks that followed, he drove that stretch of 283 4 more times. He drove it at night. He drove it in the rain. He drove it slowly, watching for the exit, watching for the green sign, watching for the road that led west. He never found it. The highway ran straight and uninterrupted through that section of Kansas, and the land on either side was empty and flat and dark, and offered no suggestion that it ever contained a town or a road, or a gas station, or a diner where cherry pie sat half-eaten on a counter, while a radio murmured static into a room where no one listened. He stopped looking. He did not stop thinking about it, but he stopped looking, because looking was beginning to feel like a compulsion, and he recognized the danger in that. He went back to his routes and his logbook and his loads and his solitary rhythmic life on the highway. The experience receded, not in the way that memories recede, fading gradually into vagueness, but in the way that a stone thrown into water recedes, sinking intact and whole into a depth where it remains exactly as it was but can no longer be reached. But sometimes, on late runs through that part of the country, when the rain is light and the road is empty, and the dark is the particular kind of dark that only the Great Plains can produce, he thinks about it. He thinks about the street lights and the porch lights and the clock that says 8:17. He thinks about the fork on the edge of the plate. He thinks about the calendar with the red circle around a date that never came. He thinks about the radio and the pattern and the static and the feeling he had, just before he turned it off, that he was about to understand something he did not want to understand. And sometimes in those moments he looks to the west, out across the flat black emptiness where the land meets the sky and neither one is visible, and he wonders if it is still there, not whether it was there because he knows it was, with the certainty of a man who has touched a thing and smelled it and stood inside it and been afraid, but whether it is still there. Now, tonight, whether the lights are on and the coffee is warm and the pie is waiting, and the clocks still show 8:17, and the town of Sutner sits in its fold of quiet, dark, patient, and illuminated, and utterly empty, existing in the space between the places that maps remember, keeping its one stopped moment like a breath that was drawn in and never released.